Welcome to the World Lens podcast, where we look at what's happening around the world each week through a global business lens. I'm your host, Michelle Evans, digital specialist at the World Trade Center Institute. And this week we're going to be discussing embassies. So, since 1963, they've been covered under the Vienna Convention on Consular Relations, which means that they are protected. And the reason we're talking about the embassies today is because of two recent high profile attacks on embassies. The Ecuadorian police raid from the Mexican police in Quito, and Israel bombed a building that was a part of Iran's embassy complex in Syria. Today I'm here with my good old pal, Bruce. How you doing?
I'm doing great.
So, Bruce, why is it such a big deal when an embassy or their staff is attacked?
It's actually a huge deal. Um, Nation states that have diplomatic missions, which means their citizens are distributed around the globe in host nation state countries,
Mm-hmm.
want to know that they're not going to run into foul play or be detained, arrested, those kind. So there's diplomatic immunity. And the embassy or the diplomatic mission is considered essentially the same as the sovereign territory of that nation, right? So if we
Mm-hmm.
have a U.S. embassy in Hungary, that property is considered the United States, right? Now it's not
Mm-hmm.
exactly that, and there's two terms that are thrown around that nobody ever uses in any normal language, like inviolable, which means
Right.
you can't violate the sanctity of these locations, and also extraterritoriality, or extraterritorial status, meaning it's property that's in the country but it's actually outside,
Mm-hmm.
under those controls. So preserving that and the sanctity of that is really important for most nations. I think
Right.
out of the 200 and some, nations, I think 180 some actually signed that
182.
convention. 182. Okay. So,
Mm-hmm.
so it's not everyone that agrees with this, but the vast majority do.
So you mentioned that good old word, inviolable. Um, so is that essentially like you get diplomatic immunity when you're in a U.S. embassy in another country? I mean,
Well, that term really applies to the host nation can't, like the police can't just like go into the embassy or into the compound
mm-hmm.
without permission, and that includes even like if it's on fire, right? The
Mm.
fire department has to get permission from the embassy to go onto the property and fight the fire. So it's that
That is
level of,
insane.
yeah, of kind of control over that area, and so yeah, the diplomatic immunity thing is a whole nother layer. And the
Mm-hmm.
reality is that most of these countries negotiate what the status of that property is, right? So
Mm-hmm.
so they will have while the convention kind of like sets these parameters, they can negotiate all the terms of this and don't actually give up sovereignty of that property.
It makes me think of like, have you ever seen the movie Safe House with Denzel Washington? And he is a fugitive from the U.S. government, and he kind of finds the U.S. embassy in the country that he's in. I think he was in South Africa, and he was safe there.
Hmm.
Like, is that really how it works? Can, an American citizen go to the U.S. embassy in any country and, declare themselves like political asylum?
Refugee, or
Yeah.
so 100%. That's why this convention and these diplomatic missions are so important to nations and countries. It's like, okay, let's say a U.S. citizen is feeling like they're being persecuted or wrongly, the police are coming after them, and they feel like they're not getting proper due process under the law, can hightail it to the embassy get in there and then have refuge for some period of time while the diplomatic channels can sort this out and try to figure out what's going on, versus them being snatched up and thrown in a prison and God knows what goes on from there, right? And there's actually even diplomatic rules about the visitation. So diplomatic mission can send someone to the prison and check on the welfare
Hmm.
of that individual and that kind of stuff if they were detained, right? And so all of those mechanisms are incredibly important.
Wow.
Mhm.
So let's dive into these recent attacks on the embassies. Let's start with Mexico. So the Ecuadorian police raided the Mexican embassy because their former vice president was there.
Mhm.
And that kind of raises another question for me. So you don't have to be a legal citizen of the country that you were.
Anyone can go, absolutely, because once they get into the diplomatic mission, the embassy,
Hmm.
they are now on U.S. soil, quote unquote. And now the Ecuadorian government should be dealing with the Mexican government, nation state to nation state, to then
Hmm.
negotiate through, the situation and determine, what needs to happen. And, in this case, he could have stayed there essentially indefinitely, right? If
Right.
they weren't able to negotiate his safe transfer from the embassy out of the country, right? So, but they chose to violate the convention and went in under force and arrested him and removed him, and that's why everyone has their hair on fire.
Yeah. I mean, why would the Mexican embassy even kind of house him? What benefit is that to them?
Again, a lot of this can be draped in geopolitics as well as
Hmm.
just normal convention of diplomatic relations. um the bottom line is for countries is to be able to take a refugee who wants asylum, evaluate that case. If the embassy feels like it's not warranted, then they can hand that person over to the local authorities, right? That would be one outcome. Or they could say, okay, yeah, we understand you're in this issue, and we're going to let you hang out here indefinitely and see what we can negotiate on your behalf with the host country and work through that process. So that's what normally happens. The host country doesn't send an armed police force into the
Right.
embassy forcefully and remove people. That's for just way outside the norms.
So, wouldn't it be beneficial for the Mexican embassy in terms of international relations to just give him up?
Absolutely not.
No?
It's actually the opposite, right? I mean, if these are territory that's under the Mexican government's control, and
Hmm.
they've given him asylum there, then that was the determination. Like, let's hear his case, and are we willing to house him here and grant him asylum and protect him or not? If they're not, then they
Hmm.
work through the process to, yes, hand him back to the Ecuadorians. But in this case, they could see that, as we saw, he does have fear of his life,
Right.
and the Mexicans said, no, we're going to let this cool
Storm the
down,
castle.
and let's negotiate this and figure out, in a more proper way, how best to resolve this issue.
So, has there been any instances where a political dissident, sorry, I can't say the word, or someone similar sought shelter in an American embassy?
Many over the years. Yeah, I mean, we've had Russian military, officers, and Russian, dissidents, and Chinese dissidents, from Tiananmen Square, and others, So yeah, so there's a long. A matter of fact, in the 50s, there was a Hungarian cardinal that
Hmm.
was housed at the embassy in Bucharest for like 15 years. He
Hmm.
was like anti-fascist, blah blah blah. Seeked asylum. Were able never. I think they eventually did allow him out, but anyway, they wouldn't negotiate his safe passage from the embassy out of the country, so he lived in the embassy compound for 15 years.
So Mexico
Hmm.
said that they were going to take the matter to the International Court of Justice,
Hmm.
and they also suspended their relations with Ecuador. Is that gonna affect like business between the countries at all?
It can complicate things, as far as Ecuador and Mexico are concerned.
Mm-hmm.
Because embassies do a lot of things around trade and visas and all
Right.
kinds of things. So yeah, so definitely any kind of like international trade and business and those kinds of things are going to be crippled at some level between those two countries. Absolutely.
So the bombing of the Iranian embassy is a very unique case because, the attacker in this case was Israel, but it's not the same as the host state, Syria.
Hmm.
Could, they see this as like an attack on their soil?
Uh, as many things related to Israel, it's
Hmm.
complicated, right?
Yeah.
So I guess let's start with you've got Syria, who's the host country, right? And then you've got the
Hmm.
Iranian embassy, which is a diplomatic mission within their nation, right? So that's kind of that structure. So you have the Iranian little patch of Iran, and then you have Syria, who has at some level of responsibility in protecting that diplomatic mission and that embassy,
Hmm.
but nothing that's codified in any way. So just kind of a process. But I think the other piece of this is that yeah, so now Syria is there, and then you've got Israel attacking this diplomatic mission, which means they had to like go into Syrian airspace, right, and
Hmm.
violate Syria as a country. So that's an issue right there, right? And so that violation, but the complexity comes into that it wasn't the Syrians that
Right.
attacked the embassy, right? It was a third nation state that did. Now, so Israel's sitting
Exactly.
back saying, well, under the rules, if you're using a diplomatic mission, or it could be a school, hospital, whatever, for military purposes, then that's fair game.
Hmm.
Right. So Israel basically is saying, look, they were doing military planning in this facility, this building, and we took them out. That was a legitimate military target, and therefore, Iran can't like say, "Oh my God, you just missile blew up my embassy, and you have no right." And so Israel is basically going to say, "Yes, we do." And that was a valid military target, and Syria can protest the fact that they launched that attack through Syrian space
Hmm.
and take that up in the international court. But at the end of the day, the target was hit, and those generals and Quds, individuals were killed, and
Yes.
now it's up to Iran. What's the next play, right?
Yeah. Can we expect some sort of retaliation against Israel after that attack?
Oh, I can tell you from the moment it happened, Iran, is now, busily calculating how
Hmm.
best to respond to this, as they've done in the past. And they may do that through proxies. They may do that through um, other mechanisms, to weigh in on this. But oh yeah, they will come up with some formula, some actions to satisfy themselves and and their constituents that they didn't just let this go unanswered.
So, if embassies are these sort of sacred places, shouldn't there be some kind of pressure put on whichever nation violates this?
There is a huge amount of pressure going on around all of this. Diplomatic missions, especially for countries like the U.S. and others, this is a big deal. These are a big, both of these are a big deal, and
Mm-hmm.
no nation wants this convention, the Convention on Consular Relations, to break down, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, so there's intense focus on these situations and getting to a, resolution and reaffirmation of the terms of these, of the convention. So no, so there is a lot going on behind the scenes around these two incidents. Absolutely.
Yeah, I read that there have been like a history of attacks on embassies, like the Cuban embassy in the U.S., Sweden and Baghdad,
Hmm.
Russia and Kabul. And the treaty was adopted in 1963. Should there be an attempt to kind of revise it?
Well, yeah. So I think some of those that you just mentioned, and obviously the ones that we have in front of us right now, clearly are demonstrating the gaps and the situations that either weren't contemplated when they did the convention, or were contemplated but they couldn't get it the convention and those
Mm-hmm.
issues negotiated through. And so I would think, I would hope that they will convene a review and start discussions around these situations where you have a third party nation state that attacks an embassy on a host country's soil,
Right.
what are the implications, what are the options, if the host nation was to violate the convention, so what clear impact, what's the consequence of that, because basically they can just say, okay, we'll leave,
Right.
right? And that's not really, again, that the nation that's in the country wants to have that for their citizens and for trade and business and all the reasons
Exactly.
embassies exist, right?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I would hope that these situations will now spur a movement to really sit down, because it's not just embassies, right? So international organizations like the UN and the world in New York and the World Bank facility and
Mm-hmm.
in DC, and these are also extraterritorial areas where the DC police and the federal police cannot just like go into the World Bank or go into the
Right.
UN, right? They have to get permission, and
Mm-hmm.
so it's a broader structure than just embassies and consulates or diplomatic missions that all of this comes under. And given the strains around the world and the level of kinetic conflict that we're dealing with, and rising powers of China and India, and just all these dynamics, I think we
Mm-hmm.
really need to stabilize and make more clear how we host other nations, and what are the responsibilities of the host nation,
Right.
as well as what the the country that's there can expect, and get support in the international court.
It's such an interesting topic, especially all the little webs and complications that go on with it. And I'll definitely be keeping an eye on these stories moving forward.
Yeah, and
Um,
we had the whole Julian Assange
hmm.
situation. They're bringing it up again with Ecuador, right? So
Right.
so this gave them kind of like power against the United States on the world stage by
Hmm.
giving him asylum, right? Now, they it was more around human rights, and if they if he was extradited to Sweden on the sexual misconduct issues, that
Hmm.
eventually he would get handed over to the U.S., where they felt like he would not be treated fairly, that kind of thing. But at the end of the day, look, what they're standing up to the big U.S., right? By
Right.
doing this. Now, when the new president came in, what, I don't know, 7 years later, 2019, I guess.
Hmm.
He rescinded the asylum and shut it down, right? So that
Right.
pretty clearly indicates, there was a geopolitical, thread here, versus
Mm-hmm.
just human rights concerns. But so again, it can cut a couple different ways in how
Yeah.
this is used. Sure.
Bruce, thank you so much for joining me today. And of course, thank you so much for tuning in. Please visit the World Trade Center Institute online at WTCI.org for more insights, events, and opportunities. Make sure you follow us on all social channels at WTC Institute. See you all next week.